A millionaire forced her daughter to marry a humble farmer to punish her. However, she was paralyzed by what her daughter did. Eleanor Harrington stood by the tall window of her lavish parlor, one hand clutching a crystal glass of whiskey, the other drumming against the polished wood of the windowsill. The room exuded wealth: marble floors, gold-accented furniture, and an intricate chandelier that cast its glow across the space. Yet, despite the opulence surrounding her, Eleanor's face was a mask of discontent. Her sharp green eyes, colder than the drink in her hand, were fixed on the long driveway leading to the estate. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Eleanor's patience, however, was wearing thin. The moment she heard the sound of heels against the marble floor, she turned, her expression hardening like stone. Haley entered the room, her caramel blonde hair slightly disheveled and her lips curved in a defiant smirk. Her loose leather jacket and casual demeanor were an affront to the Harrington family's polished image. "You're late," Eleanor stated, her voice calm but laced with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Am I?" Haley replied, tossing her purse onto a nearby chair. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze narrowing. "Where were you?" "Out," Haley answered nonchalantly. "With him?" Eleanor snapped, her tone suddenly icy. Haley rolled her eyes. "If you mean Noah, then yes, I was with him. Is that a crime now?" Eleanor's hand tightened around her glass, but she managed to keep her composure. "That man is beneath you, Haley. An artist with no money, no standing, no future. He is nothing but a starving dreamer. And maybe that's what I want," Haley shot back, her voice rising. "Someone who cares about more than bank accounts and stock portfolios." The words hit Eleanor like a slap, though she gave no indication of it. Instead, she took a deliberate sip of her whiskey and set the glass down with a soft clink. "You're a Harrington," she said coolly. "Your life is not yours to squander on foolish whims. You have responsibilities, a legacy to uphold." Haley let out a bitter laugh. "A legacy? You mean a gilded prison where you pull all the strings and no one gets a say?" Eleanor's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "That prison," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous calm, "is the reason you've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. Do not mistake my generosity for weakness." "Generosity," Haley spat. "You control everything, my life, my choices, because you've proven incapable of making them wisely," Eleanor interrupted sharply, Haley's face flushed with anger. "You think I'm incapable because I don't want to marry some soulless CEO or follow your plan to expand the empire? Newsflash, mother. Not everyone measures success in dollars and domination." Eleanor tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "And is that what you call love? Running around with some penniless nobody who has nothing to offer but empty dreams?" Haley's hands curled into fists. "At least he has a heart, which is more than I can say for you." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of Haley's words hanging heavily between them. For a brief moment, Eleanor's mask of control slipped, her eyes narrowing with something darker. "You will end this nonsense," Eleanor said finally, her voice like ice. "No, I won't," Haley replied firmly. Eleanor took a step closer, her presence suffocating. "Then you leave me no choice." Haley frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Eleanor began, her tone slow and deliberate, "that you will marry John Montgomery." Haley blinked, her brain struggling to process the words. "Who?" "John Montgomery," Eleanor repeated. "He works on our land, a simple, hard-working man. Exactly what you need to learn some discipline and respect." Haley stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "You've lost your mind," Eleanor smirked. "Not at all. The arrangements are already in motion. The wedding will take place in 2 weeks." Haley let out a stunned laugh. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "You have 2 choices. Marry John and prove you're capable of adapting, or leave this house with nothing." Haley's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." Eleanor turned to the desk and picked up a thick folder, tossing it onto the table in front of Haley. Curious despite herself, Haley opened it, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside were documents, bank statements, credit reports, all showing that her accounts were now frozen. "I've given you everything your entire life," Eleanor said coldly. "But if you refuse this marriage, I will take it all back. Every penny, every privilege. Let's see how far you get with your artist boyfriend when you have nothing to offer him." Haley's hands trembled as she stared at the papers. "You can't do this." "I already have," Eleanor replied. The room spun as Haley tried to process the ultimatum. She wanted to walk away, to call her mother's bluff. But where would she go? And what would Noah think when he realized she had nothing left? Eleanor took a step back, her expression as calm as ever. 2 weeks, she said, turning toward the door. "Make your decision wisely." As Eleanor's heels clicked against the marble, Haley stood frozen, her world crumbling beneath her feet. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. The Harrington estate was quiet the morning of the wedding, but the silence felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves disapproved of the occasion. Haley sat in front of an ornate mirror in her childhood bedroom, staring at her reflection with a mixture of disbelief and fury. The white dress she wore, simple, practical, and chosen by her mother, was a far cry from the extravagant gown she'd once imagined for herself. This wasn't a day of celebration, and the dress felt more like a costume in a performance she had no desire to star in. "Haley, it's time." Eleanor's voice came from the doorway, cold and detached. Haley turned, her face set in a mask of defiance. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Eleanor stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark green ensemble that exuded power and control. "This isn't about enjoyment. It's about teaching you a lesson." Haley stood, the fabric of the dress rustling as she moved. "And what lesson is that, Mother?" "That you can strip me of everything and force me into a life I don't want." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "The lesson is that actions have consequences, Haley. You've spent your life rebelling, and now it's time to face reality." Haley wanted to scream, to throw something, but instead, she took a deep breath and met her mother's eyes. "You'll regret this." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. "We'll see." The ceremony itself was brief and devoid of emotion. It took place in the small chapel on the edge of the Harrington estate, with only a handful of witnesses, primarily staff who had been coerced into attending. Haley barely glanced at John Montgomery as they stood side by side at the altar. She'd seen him a few times before, working on the Harrington land, but they'd never spoken. He was tall, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that hinted at a life of hard work. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes were calm, almost resigned. The priest's voice droned on, but Haley barely heard the words. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, humiliation, and a growing sense of despair. When the ceremony ended and the priest announced them as husband and wife, Haley's stomach churned. John turned to her, his expression unreadable, and offered his arm. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. The reception, or what passed for one, was equally perfunctory. A small table had been set up outside the chapel, adorned with modest decorations and a simple cake. Eleanor stood nearby, watching everything with an air of satisfaction. Haley couldn't bring herself to touch the food. She sat in silence, avoiding John's gaze as she fidgeted with the edge of her dress. "Are you okay?" John asked quietly, his voice low and steady. Haley looked up at him, startled. It was the first time he'd spoken to her since the ceremony began. "What do you think?" she replied, her tone sharp. John didn't flinch. "I think this situation isn't easy for either of us." Haley's eyes narrowed. "Oh, really? What's so hard for you? You just got a free ticket to a better life." John's expression darkened, but he kept his voice calm. "I didn't ask for this. Haley, I agreed because I had no choice. Just like you." Haley opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't considered that John might feel just as trapped as she did. Eleanor approached then, her presence casting a shadow over the table. "It's time for you two to leave," she said briskly. "The car is waiting to take you to the farm." Haley's stomach tightened. This was it. The final blow. She was being banished from the life she'd always known. The ride to the farm was long and silent. Haley stared out the window, watching as the sprawling luxury of the Harrington estate gave way to open fields and modest homes. She couldn't bring herself to look at John, who sat beside her with his hands resting on his knees. When the car pulled up to the farmhouse, Haley felt a pang of dread. It was small and unassuming, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, a far cry from the opulence she'd grown up with. John climbed out first, grabbing the single suitcase Eleanor had allowed Haley to bring. "Welcome home," he said, his tone neutral. Haley stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the dirt. She looked around, taking in the worn-down barn, the overgrown garden, and the chickens pecking at the ground. It was like stepping into another world. "This can't be happening," she muttered under her breath. John led the way inside, setting her suitcase down in the small living room. The house smelled of wood and earth, a stark contrast to the floral-scented air of the Harrington mansion. "I'll show you your room," John said, his voice still calm. Haley followed him up the narrow staircase to a small bedroom with plain walls and a simple bed. She stared at it, her mind racing. "I'll give you some space," John said, stepping back. When he left, Haley sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give her mother the satisfaction. This wasn't the life she wanted, but for now, it was the life she had. The morning sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Haley's new bedroom, casting long streaks of gold across the plain wooden floor. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious blackout drapes in her room back at the Harrington mansion. Haley sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the wrinkled dress from the day before. Sleep had evaded her, and her mind raced with thoughts of anger and disbelief. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Haley," John's voice called softly from the other side. "Breakfast is ready." She didn't respond, staring blankly at the wall. After a few moments, the sound of his footsteps retreated down the stairs. Haley finally stood, her limbs heavy as if weighed down by the gravity of her new reality. She pulled on a pair of jeans and a sweater from her suitcase, the only remnants of her previous life that she was allowed to bring. Descending the stairs, she found John sitting at the small kitchen table, a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. A second plate sat across from him, untouched. "Good morning," he said cautiously, his blue eyes studying her expression. "Is it?" Haley muttered, as she slid into the chair, her tone dripping with sarcasm. John didn't reply, instead focusing on his plate. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the occasional clink of John's fork against his plate. Haley picked at her food, her appetite non-existent. The sight of the humble kitchen, the mismatched chairs, the chipped countertop, the faint smell of earth lingering in the air, only added to her sense of despair. This wasn't her home. It never would be. "I need you to understand something," Haley said abruptly, breaking the silence. John looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "I didn't choose this," she continued, her voice firm. "I didn't choose you, and I don't plan on staying here any longer than I have to." John's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or maybe resignation. "I know," he said quietly. "Neither of us chose this." "Then why did you agree to it?" Haley snapped, her frustration bubbling to the surface. John set his fork down and leaned back in his chair. "Because your mother gave me an ultimatum. Either I agreed to this arrangement, or I'd lose everything I've worked for, the farm. The land. It's my livelihood. I didn't have a choice." Haley stared at him, her anger momentarily replaced by confusion. She hadn't expected such honesty. "Look," John continued, his voice steady, "I'm not here to make your life miserable. I'm just trying to do what I can to keep this place running. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But while you're here, I think we should at least try to make this work." Haley scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Make this work? This isn't a marriage, John. It's a punishment. And I'm not about to play house with someone I barely know." John didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he stood and began clearing the table, his movements deliberate. "Suit yourself," he said simply, his tone devoid of malice. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension. Haley wandered the property, her designer sneakers crunching against the gravel paths that wove through the farm. Everywhere she looked, she was reminded of how far she'd fallen from her previous life. The barn, weathered and worn, stood in stark contrast to the pristine stables she used to ride in as a child. The fields stretched endlessly under the autumn sun, their beauty lost on her as she brooded over her situation. By mid-afternoon, Haley found herself standing near the chicken coop, her arms crossed as she watched John repair a section of the fence. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his movements were efficient, practiced. "You do this every day?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. John glanced up, surprised by her question. "Pretty much," he replied. "Why?" John straightened, resting his hands on his hips. "Because it's my job. This farm doesn't run itself." Haley shook her head. "It just seems pointless. All this work for what? A few crops, some eggs?" John frowned, but his tone remained even. "It might not seem like much to you, but this is my life. It's honest work, and it puts food on the table. That's enough for me." Haley opened her mouth to retort, but stopped herself. She didn't understand his contentment with such a simple existence. It baffled her, even irritated her, as the days turned into weeks. Haley's disdain for the farm only grew. She struggled to adjust to the routines John had mastered over years of hard work. The early mornings, the physical labor, the dirt. It was all foreign and uncomfortable. She avoided John as much as possible, retreating to her room whenever she could. But John, to his credit, never complained. He continued his work without expecting anything from Haley, giving her the space she clearly wanted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Haley stood by the window of her room, staring out at the vast fields bathed in golden light. She hated this place, hated everything it represented, but deep down, a small voice whispered a truth she wasn't ready to acknowledge. This wasn't just about the farm, it was about her. She wasn't sure who she was without the comforts and privileges of her old life, and that realization scared her more than she was willing to admit. Haley woke up to the distant sound of a rooster crowing. She groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. Every morning since she'd arrived, she had been jolted awake at an ungodly hour by the same annoying noise. It was just another reminder of how much her life had changed. She had spent the last few weeks doing her best to avoid John, to ignore the farm, and to remind herself that this situation was only temporary. But no matter how much she tried to resist, the reality of her new life was settling in. She was stuck, and worse, she had no idea how to escape. Frustrated, she threw the blanket off and climbed out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The farmhouse had no luxury heating system, no warm marble to step onto like in the Harrington mansion, just rough wood and the faint scent of earth that seemed embedded in the walls. Haley pulled on a sweater and made her way downstairs, expecting to find an empty kitchen as she usually did. But today, John was there, standing by the stove, flipping pancakes in a skillet. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a brief second, the scene felt oddly normal. John glanced over his shoulder when he heard her enter. "Morning." Haley blinked, caught off guard. "You cook." He smirked slightly. "It's either that or starve." She hesitated before pulling out a chair and sitting at the small wooden table. John slid a plate in front of her, 2 golden pancakes with a drizzle of syrup. She stared at them, unsure. "You don't have to eat if you don't want to," he said, sitting across from her. "But you should. You barely touch your food most days." Haley frowned. "Why do you care?" John took a sip of his coffee, studying her. "Because you're living here now. Whether you like it or not, you need to take care of yourself." Haley poked at her pancakes with her fork, her appetite weak. But after a moment, she took a small bite. They were surprisingly good. She wouldn't admit it, though. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound being the occasional clink of silverware against the plates. Haley could feel John watching her, not in a scrutinizing way, but in a way that made her uneasy. "You don't have to hate it here, you know," he said finally. Haley sighed, setting her fork down. "And you don't have to act like this is normal." John leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I never said it was normal, but it's what we have to work with," Haley scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You chose this life. I didn't." John's jaw tightened slightly. "You think this is easy for me? You think I wanted to wake up one day and find out I was getting married to someone who didn't want to be here?" Haley fell silent. She hadn't really considered that before. In her mind, John had always been the lucky one, the one who had gained something from this deal. But the truth was, he had been just as powerless as she was. John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I'm not asking you to love this place. I'm not even asking you to like it. But maybe if you stopped fighting it so much, things wouldn't be so miserable." Haley stared at him for a long moment. She wanted to argue, to tell him that she had every right to be miserable, but the words didn't come, because deep down, a part of her knew he wasn't wrong before she could respond. A loud crash echoed from outside. John shot up from his chair. "Damn it," he muttered, rushing to the door. Curious, Haley followed him out to the front porch, where she saw one of the farm's old wooden fences had collapsed under the weight of last night's heavy rain. A group of cows had wandered out, some heading toward the fields. "Great," John muttered. "Just what I needed." Haley crossed her arms. "So what now? You chase them down?" John shot her a look. "Something like that." He grabbed a rope from a nearby hook and jogged toward the field. Haley stood there, watching as John moved swiftly through the wet grass, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He wasn't panicked or irritated. He just worked, efficiently and methodically, rounding up the cows with a calm determination. She had always associated farm work with struggle and desperation. But John didn't look desperate. He looked capable, strong, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She hated that she found it impressive. Sighing, she stepped off the porch, her sneakers sinking slightly into the damp earth. She winced in disgust but kept walking, heading toward the fence. "You need help," she called out before she could stop herself. John, who had been guiding one of the cows back toward the pasture, glanced up, clearly surprised. "You offering?" he asked. Haley hesitated. I might as well do something." John nodded toward the other cows. "All right, just walk behind them. Guide them toward the gate. Don't spook them." Haley bit her lip. "And how do I not spook them?" "Move slow, don't make sudden noises." Haley sighed. "Great. Just great." Still, she did as he said, cautiously stepping toward one of the cows. It turned its large, dark eyes toward her, and for a moment, Haley thought it might charge at her, but then it simply flicked its tail and continued grazing. She exhaled in relief. Slowly, she started walking behind it, guiding it toward the open gate where John was waiting. It wasn't exactly graceful, but it worked. By the time they had all the cows back in the pasture, Haley's sneakers were covered in mud. Her hair was messy, and she was breathing harder than she cared to admit. John secured the gate and looked at her with an amused expression. "Not bad, city girl." Haley glared at him. "Don't get used to it." John chuckled, shaking his head as he turned back toward the house. Haley followed, brushing dirt off her jeans. She wouldn't admit it, but there had been a strange sense of satisfaction in helping. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt just the slightest crack in the wall she had built around herself. The next morning, Haley woke up with sore legs. She groaned as she stretched, realizing with some irritation that just a little bit of farm work had already made her muscles ache. She was used to Pilates sessions in exclusive studios, not trudging through muddy fields after livestock. Still, there was something strangely satisfying about yesterday. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but working alongside John had given her a fleeting sense of accomplishment. Not that she would ever say that out loud. She took her time getting dressed before heading downstairs, half expecting John to already be gone. But when she walked into the kitchen, she found him sitting at the table, reading an old newspaper while sipping his coffee. He glanced up. Morning, she muttered, grabbing a glass of water. John set down the paper and gestured toward the back door. "I'm heading out to fix the fence later. The cows broke it again last night." Haley leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Guess that's what happens when you have a bunch of animals with no concept of personal space." John smirked. "John, pretty much." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "You want to help?" Haley blinked. "Help? With the fence?" "Yeah," he shrugged. "You already proved you can handle the cows. Figured maybe you'd want to try something different." She frowned, trying to figure out if he was messing with her. "I don't know anything about fixing fences. That's why I'd be showing you," he said simply. Haley hesitated. A part of her wanted to refuse outright, to remind him that she wasn't here to play farmer, but another part, the part that had felt an odd flicker of pride when she had helped with the cows, was curious. She sighed. "Fine, But if I get a splinter, I'm suing you. John chuckled. Fair enough. An hour later, Haley stood by the broken fence, hands on her hips, looking at the damage. The section had completely collapsed overnight, leaving a gap big enough for the cows to wander through if they wanted to. John handed her a pair of work gloves. Put these on. She slipped them on, feeling ridiculous. And now what? John grabbed a wooden plank and placed it against the broken section. We're replacing the old pieces with new ones. I'll show you how to line them up, nail them in, and make sure it holds. Haley watched as he demonstrated, his movements precise and efficient. He made it look effortless, but when it was her turn, she quickly realized how much strength it actually required. She picked up a plank, awkwardly positioning it against the post. Like this. John stepped beside her, adjusting the angle slightly. A little higher, yeah, there. Haley nodded, gripping a hammer. She swung it toward the nail, expecting it to go in easily. Instead, the hammer bounced off the metal, and the impact sent a jolt through her hand. Ow! She shook her hand, glaring at the nail like it had personally offended her. John chuckled. Gotta hold it steady here. He reached out, steadying the nail with one hand. Try again. She exhaled sharply and swung again, this time managing to drive the nail in without jarring her entire arm. It wasn't perfect, but it held. Not bad, John said. You're getting it. Haley rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the small flicker of satisfaction she felt. They worked for the next few hours, replacing the broken planks one by one. It was exhausting, and Haley's arms ached from the unfamiliar effort. But as the fence slowly took shape, she realized she wasn't hating it as much as she had expected. At one point, she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, glancing at John as he worked beside her. He had rolled up his sleeves, his tanned skin glistening slightly under the sun. He wasn't some clueless farmhand. He knew exactly what he was doing, and there was an ease in the way he moved, like he belonged out here in a way she never could. She quickly looked away, annoyed at herself for noticing. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, and Haley was exhausted. She leaned against the newly repaired fence, letting out a breath. I can't believe people do this every day, John smirked. Guess you've never had to work for a living, huh? Haley shot him a glare. I've worked? Really? His tone was teasing. Doing what? She hesitated. I managed events for charity galas and I interned at a fashion magazine once. John raised an eyebrow. Interned as in, got coffee and answered phones. Haley pursed her lips. It was still work. He laughed. Sure, city girl. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Haley realized how different she felt compared to when she had first arrived. She was still angry about being here, still frustrated by how her life had been upended. But something was shifting. Maybe it was the satisfaction of actually accomplishing something, even if it was just fixing a fence. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, she and John had worked together without biting each other's heads off. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because, for a brief moment, she had forgotten to be miserable. That realization unsettled her more than anything else. That evening, as Haley sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she heard footsteps behind her. John sat down on the step beside her, a beer in hand. He didn't say anything at first, just looked out at the field stretching into the distance. You did good today, he finally said. Haley scoffed. Don't get used to it. He smirked, but didn't argue. A comfortable silence settled between them, the first since she had arrived. Haley didn't know what to make of it. She still had no plans of staying here. She still hated that her mother had done this to her. But for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she hated everything about it. And that thought terrified her. The next morning, Haley woke up with every muscle in her body aching. It was a deep, unfamiliar soreness, the kind she had never experienced after a yoga class or a light jog on a treadmill, fixing fences and wrangling cows. Apparently, worked muscles she didn't even know she had. She groaned as she rolled out of bed, rubbing her shoulders. Maybe John had a point. She had never truly worked a day in her life before coming here. Downstairs, she found the kitchen empty, the remnants of John's breakfast still on the table. She glanced at the clock. It was barely past 7, and he was already out in the fields. Determined not to let the day be another reminder of how out of place she was, Haley grabbed a cup of coffee and stepped outside. The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she scanned the property. In the distance, she spotted John near the barn, stacking bales of hay onto the back of an old truck. She hesitated, an unfamiliar feeling creeping into her chest. Yesterday, for the first time, she had felt a spark of something that wasn't outright hatred toward this place. A sense of accomplishment, maybe even a tiny bit of pride, but that didn't mean she was ready to embrace this life. Still, her feet carried her toward the barn. Before her mind could stop them, John noticed her approach and paused, resting his hands on his hips. "You're up early?" Haley shrugged. "I couldn't sleep." He nodded toward the hay. "You want to help again?" She hesitated for only a second before lifting her chin. "Fine, but if I throw out my back, you're paying my hospital bills." John smirked. "Noted." She stepped forward, gripping the twine around one of the hay bales, and immediately regretted it. The thing was heavier than it looked, and when she tried to lift it, it barely moved. John chuckled. "You gotta use your legs, not your back." Haley scowled. "I know that." She tried again, this time managing to hoist it up, but the awkward weight made her stumble slightly. John caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy there." Haley jerked her arm away. "I've got it." John raised his hands in surrender. "All right, tough girl." For the next hour, Haley stubbornly threw herself into the task, refusing to admit how difficult it was. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and sweat dripped down her back as she heaved bale after bale onto the truck. John worked beside her, his movements efficient and effortless. She hated how easy it was for him, how he made it look like second nature. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said after a while, glancing at her flushed face. "I'm fine," Haley snapped. John wiped sweat from his brow and studied her for a moment. "You're trying to prove something." Haley ignored him, lifting another bale and tossing it onto the truck. "I don't know what you're talking about." John sighed. "You're stubborn as hell, you know that." She turned to him, crossing her arms. "What, because I don't want to look weak?" John shook his head. "No, because you'd rather kill yourself trying to prove you don't belong here instead of just learning how to do things the right way." Haley opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, because deep down, she knew he was right. She wasn't just trying to help. She was trying to prove that this place wasn't changing her, that she wasn't adapting, that she could do this on her own terms or not at all. And yet, here she was, working on a farm, learning. The realization made her stomach twist. Before she could process it, a sharp pain shot through her hand as she tried to lift another bale. She yelped, dropping it instantly. John was beside her in a second. "What happened?" Haley clutched her hand, hissing in pain. "I think I pulled something." John gently took her wrist, inspecting her fingers. "You strained it," he said. "You need to rest." Haley yanked her hand away. "I don't need to rest, I'm fine." John gave her a pointed look. "You can barely move your fingers." Haley clenched her jaw. "I just need a minute." John exhaled through his nose, clearly holding back his frustration. "Haley, stop. You're not proving anything by hurting yourself." She hated how reasonable he sounded, hated even more that he was right. With a defeated sigh, she muttered, "Fine." John nodded, satisfied. "Come on, let's get you inside." Back in the kitchen, Haley sat at the table, cradling her sore hand as John rummaged through a cabinet. He returned with a small first aid kit, pulling out a cold compress and some bandages. "You really don't have to do this," she muttered as he sat across from her. John ignored her, wrapping the compress around her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers warm against her skin. Haley swallowed hard, suddenly feeling too aware of how close they were. "You need to be smarter about this," John said, focused on his task. "No one's expecting you to be a farmhand overnight." Haley let out a humorless laugh. "You think I'm trying to be a farmhand?" John smirked. "I think you're trying to prove something to yourself, and maybe to me." She rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. John finished wrapping her hand and leaned back. "There, try not to do anything stupid with it." Haley flexed her fingers carefully, the pain already dulling under the ice. "Thanks," she muttered. John grinned. "Was that so hard?" "Shut up," she said. But there was no real bite behind her words. That night, as Haley lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about what John had said. Was she really fighting so hard because she didn't want to belong here? Or was she afraid that she was starting to? The thought unsettled her. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but something was shifting inside her, and for the first time, she didn't know whether to fight it or let it happen. The next morning, Haley woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window. The sky was an overcast gray, and a cold draft seeped through the old wooden frame of her bedroom. She groaned, stretching her sore hand before carefully unwrapping the bandage John had put on her the day before. The swelling had gone down, but the ache lingered, a reminder of how foolish she had been. Trying to prove something that didn't need proving, she had spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying John's words in her head. He had seen right through her, and that irritated her more than she cared to admit. With a sigh, she got out of bed and made her way downstairs. The kitchen smelled of coffee and something warm. Oatmeal. Maybe. John was standing by the stove stirring a pot, his usual calm demeanor in place. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning," she replied, hesitating for a moment before sitting at the table. He glanced at her hand. "How's it feeling?" "Better," she admitted, flexing her fingers. "Good. Try not to injure yourself again today," he said with a smirk. She rolled her eyes. "I'll do my best." He placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her and sat down across the table with his own. Haley stared at it for a moment before taking a small bite. It was simple, but surprisingly good. They ate in silence for a while, the rain tapping against the window filling the quiet. Haley wasn't used to such stillness. Her life before had been full of noise. Endless phone calls, city traffic, people always talking, always moving. But here, in this farmhouse, the quiet wasn't empty. It felt steady, grounded. John cleared his throat. "Rain's gonna make things a mess today. Won't be able to do much outside." Haley looked up. "So what do you do on days like this?" John took a sip of his coffee. "Fix things around the house, take stock of supplies, catch up on bookkeeping." Haley raised an eyebrow. "You do bookkeeping?" He chuckled. "What? You think farmers just throw seeds in the ground and hope for the best? This place is a business, Haley. It takes planning." She considered that for a moment. She had never thought of a farm as something that required strategy. To her, farming had always seemed like a life of blind luck, dependent on the weather and the seasons. "I could help," she found herself saying. John looked at her, surprised. "With what?" "The bookkeeping," she said quickly, as if saying it too slow would make her regret it. "I mean, I did take a couple of business courses in college, and I used to help my mom's company with financial reports sometimes." John tilted his head, studying her. "You sure?" She shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I figure if I'm stuck here, I might as well do something useful." A slow smile spread across his face. "All right, city girl, let's see what you've got." John led her to the small office tucked away near the back of the house. It was cluttered but functional, with stacks of papers piled on an old wooden desk and a filing cabinet that looked like it had been there for decades. "Welcome to the glamorous world of farm accounting," John said dryly, gesturing to the mess of invoices and records. Haley raised an eyebrow. "I've seen worse." She sat at the desk and started sifting through the papers, scanning numbers and notes. John pulled up a chair beside her, watching as she sorted everything into categories. "You're pretty organized," he admitted. "I had to be," she said, not looking up. "Growing up in my mother's world. If you didn't stay 2 steps ahead, you got trampled." John was quiet for a moment before saying, "That must have been exhausting." Haley stilled. No one had ever said that to her before. People assumed her life had been easy because she was rich, but they didn't see the constant pressure, the expectations that weighed on her every decision. She exhaled, pushing the thought aside. "So, what's the biggest expense on the farm?" she asked. Shifting the topic, John pointed to a stack of invoices. "Feed, mostly. Equipment maintenance, too." Haley scanned the numbers, her brows furrowing. "You're spending way too much on feed. You should be buying in bulk from a cooperative, not from individual suppliers." John smirked. "And how do you know that?" She glanced at him. "Because I actually paid attention in business class." He chuckled. "All right, smart girl, show me how it's done." They spent the next few hours going over the farm's finances. Haley surprised herself with how quickly she got into it, running numbers and pointing out areas where John could cut costs. He listened, nodding along, occasionally asking questions. At some point, she forgot she was supposed to hate being here. You know, John said as she finished drafting a new budget plan. For someone who claims she doesn't belong here, you sure have a knack for this. Haley rolled her eyes. Don't get any ideas. I'm not suddenly in love with farm life. John smirked. Sure, whatever you say. She opened her mouth to argue but found herself smiling instead. That night, as Haley lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she felt something different settle in her chest. For the first time since she had arrived, she had felt useful, not just as a reluctant participant, but as someone who had contributed. It was a strange feeling, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. Haley woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp earth, a reminder of last night's rain. She stretched, rolling her shoulders, and was surprised to find that, for the first time since arriving at the farm, she didn't immediately dread the day ahead. The feeling unsettled her. She had spent weeks resisting everything about this place, resenting John, the farm, her mother, and the situation she had been forced into. But something was shifting yesterday. While working through the finances with John, she had felt something she hadn't expected: satisfaction. It was a small thing, but for the first time, she had contributed in a way that mattered. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Shaking off the thought, she got up and dressed in a pair of jeans and an old sweatshirt. When she stepped into the kitchen, John was already there, sipping his coffee while flipping through a newspaper. He glanced up. "Morning. Morning," she replied, grabbing herself a cup of coffee and taking a seat across from him. John set down the paper and studied her. "You ready to do some real work today?" Haley raised an eyebrow. "Fixing fences and chasing cows wasn't real work," he smirked. "That was beginner-level stuff today. You're learning about crops," Haley groaned. "Great. More dirt," John chuckled. "You'll survive." Outside, the sky was a brilliant blue, the sun warming the damp soil beneath their feet. The scent of freshly turned earth filled the air as they walked toward a section of the field where rows of crops stretched out in neat lines. "All right, city girl," John said, stopping beside a row of young plants. "You ever planted anything before?" Haley scoffed. "Do succulents count?" John smirked. "Not really." He crouched down, running his fingers through the soil. "This is where everything starts. The quality of the soil, how we treat it, determines how good the harvest will be." Haley knelt beside him, hesitantly touching the dirt. It was soft, rich, nothing like the lifeless patches of grass in the courtyards of her mother's estate. John handed her a small trowel. "We're planting some new crops today. I'll show you how it's done." Haley watched as he dug a small hole, gently placed a seedling inside, and covered it with soil. His hands were steady, methodical, like he had done this 1,000 times before. She mimicked his actions, struggling at first to get the depth right. John didn't correct her immediately, letting her figure it out when she finally managed to plant one properly. He nodded in approval. "Not bad," he said. Haley sat back, brushing dirt from her hands. "You make it look easier than it is." John shrugged. "That's because I've been doing this my whole life." They continued working side by side, planting row after row of seedlings. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and sweat clung to Haley's back. But she didn't complain. She had stopped thinking about how much she hated being here. For the first time, she was just doing. After what felt like hours, John stood and stretched. "All right, I think that's enough for today." Haley wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "That was exhausting," John smirked. "Welcome to farm life." They walked back toward the house, and as they reached the porch, John turned to her. "You hungry?" Haley nodded. "Starving." "Good," he said. "Because you're cooking." Haley's eyes widened. "What?" John chuckled. "You want to survive out here? You gotta learn how to cook something other than instant noodles." Haley crossed her arms. "That's offensive. I can also make scrambled eggs." John laughed. "All right, let's put that to the test." The kitchen felt oddly warm as they worked together. John pulled ingredients from the pantry while Haley hesitated in front of the stove, trying to remember the last time she had cooked something from scratch. John handed her a skillet. "All right, chef, show me what you got." Haley sighed, cracking an egg into the pan. It sizzled immediately, and for a moment, she felt a ridiculous sense of accomplishment. John leaned against the counter, watching with amusement. "Not bad. Now add some seasoning." Haley sprinkled some salt and pepper over the eggs, stirring them with a spatula. She stole a glance at John, who nodded approvingly. "See?" he said. "Not so bad, right?" Haley shrugged. "I guess." They ate together at the small kitchen table, the conversation flowing easier than before. Haley found herself asking questions about the farm, about how John had learned to do everything on his own. He answered patiently, his voice steady, as if he had long since accepted his place in the world. Haley wasn't sure she could ever feel that kind of certainty. That night, as she lay in bed, Haley felt something unfamiliar. Contentment. It wasn't the same as happiness, but it was close. She still didn't know what her future looked like. She still resented her mother for forcing her into this situation, but for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to leave, and that terrified her more than anything. The days on the farm began to blur together, each one rolling into the next like a slow-moving current. Haley found herself slipping into a rhythm she never thought possible, waking up early, drinking coffee with John, helping around the farm in small ways. She still resisted calling it her life, still told herself this was temporary, but deep down, she knew something had changed. She wasn't fighting it as hard anymore. It was late afternoon when she found herself in the barn, sorting through a stack of old equipment John had asked her to check. The air smelled of hay and earth, and soft beams of light streamed through the wooden slats, catching the dust floating in the air. John was on the other side of the barn, working on a broken plow. His shirt was slightly damp with sweat, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms covered in dust and grease. Haley tried not to stare, but she had to admit, he fit this life in a way she never had, and yet, she was starting to feel less like an outsider. She shook the thought away and refocused on the task in front of her. She picked up an old, rusted tool, turning it over in her hands. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly. John looked up. "Tired of what?" "This." She gestured around them. "The farm, the same routine every day. Doesn't it get boring?" John chuckled, setting down his wrench. "It's not boring when everything depends on you getting it right. If I slack off, the crops fail. If I ignore a sick animal, we lose livestock. It's not about excitement. It's about responsibility." Haley frowned, letting his words sink in. Responsibility. That was something she had never truly been forced to carry. Her whole life had been mapped out for her. Decisions made by her mother. Choices that weren't really choices at all. John leaned against the workbench, wiping his hands with a rag. "What about you? You ever think about what you actually want to do with your life?" Haley hesitated. "I used to think I did." John tilted his head. "And now?" She sighed. "Now, I don't know. I used to believe I wanted the glamorous life. Big events, luxury, all of it. But after everything, I'm not sure anymore." John studied her for a long moment before saying, "Maybe that's not a bad thing." Haley arched an eyebrow. "Not knowing what I want." "Yeah," he said simply. "It means you're open to figuring it out." She didn't know how to respond to that before she could say anything. A loud crack of thunder rumbled in the distance. She turned toward the barn doors and saw dark storm clouds rolling over the horizon. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees and sending loose hay swirling around them. John stood upright, his expression instantly shifting. "Damn it, that storm's coming in fast." Haley glanced at him. "What do we do?" John grabbed a pair of gloves and tossed her an extra set. "We need to secure everything. Make sure the animals are in the barn. Check the fences so nothing gets loose. Come on." They rushed outside, the wind growing stronger by the second. Haley's hair whipped around her face as she followed John toward the pasture. The cows were restless, sensing the incoming storm. John moved quickly, securing the gates and leading the animals toward the shelter of the barn. Haley did her best to help, though she knew she was slowing him down. Another clap of thunder boomed overhead, and Haley flinched as fat raindrops began to pelt her skin. "Get inside," John shouted over the wind. "What about you?" she yelled back. "I need to check the south fence. Go." Haley hesitated for only a second before running toward the barn, her clothes already drenched by the sudden downpour. She turned just as John disappeared into the storm, his figure barely visible through the sheets of rain. Inside, the barn was filled with the sounds of restless animals. Haley caught her breath, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. She hated this feeling, waiting, helpless, unsure if John would come back safe. Minutes passed, then more. The storm raged outside, shaking the old barn walls. Finally, the doors swung open, and John stumbled in, soaked to the bone and covered in mud. Haley rushed to him. "Are you okay?" He nodded, breathing hard. "Fence is holding. For now." Haley exhaled, relieved. "You're an idiot for staying out so long." John smirked despite himself. "You worried about me." "City girl." Haley crossed her arms. "Absolutely not. I just don't want to be stuck taking care of this farm alone." John chuckled, shaking water from his hair. "Sure." They stood there for a moment, the storm raging around them. Yet inside the barn, it felt strangely quiet. Haley met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. And for the first time, she didn't feel like running away. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the farm damp and the air crisp. Puddles reflected the early sunlight, and the ground squelched under Haley's boots as she stepped outside. She tugged her sweater tighter around her, the chill of the morning seeping through the fabric. John was already in the field, inspecting the fence he had reinforced during the storm. His figure was a silhouette against the horizon, tall and steady, as if nothing could faze him. Haley watched him for a moment, something unrecognizable stirring in her chest. Shaking off the thought, she made her way toward him. "How bad is it?" she asked when she was close enough. John glanced at her, his eyes scanning her face before turning back to the fence. "Could have been worse. A few posts are loose, but it held up." Haley crouched to examine the base of one of the posts. "So, what now? Do we fix it?" John chuckled softly. "You're getting the hang of this farm thing, aren't you?" Haley rolled her eyes. "Don't push it." But deep down, she felt a flicker of pride at the acknowledgement. They spent the morning repairing the fence together, working side by side in companionable silence. Haley's movements were more confident now, her hands steady as she hammered nails and tightened ropes. She wasn't perfect. Her arms still ached from the effort, and she occasionally misjudged a swing. But she was learning. John, as always, was patient. He didn't hover or micromanage, but he was quick to offer guidance when she needed it. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, and Haley's stomach growled loudly. "Sounds like you're ready for lunch," John said, smirking. Haley wiped sweat from her brow. "If you're offering, I'm not saying no." Back in the kitchen, Haley helped John prepare sandwiches. It wasn't much. Just bread, cheese, and some leftover roast from the night before, but it tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. As they ate, John leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, you know." Haley looked up from her plate, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you got here, you wouldn't even touch the dirt. Now you're fixing fences and planting crops like it's second nature." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. Compliments weren't something she was used to receiving, at least not ones that felt genuine. "I guess I'm just adapting," she said finally. John nodded. "That's more than most people would do in your situation." Haley studied him for a moment. "You really think I'm not a total disaster out here?" He laughed. "I think you're stubborn as hell, but you've got grit. That counts for a lot." She couldn't help but smile, though she quickly masked it by taking another bite of her sandwich. After lunch, John suggested they check on the crops to make sure the storm hadn't caused any damage. Haley followed him out to the fields, where the rows of plants were damp but intact. As they walked, Haley found herself asking questions about the different crops, the seasons, how John decided what to plant and when. He answered patiently, explaining the intricacies of farming in a way that made it sound almost like an art form. "You really love this, don't you?" she said suddenly, interrupting him mid-sentence. John paused, glancing at her. "Yeah," he said simply. "I do." Haley looked out over the fields, the endless expanse of green stretching toward the horizon. She had always thought of farming as dull, monotonous work, but seeing it through John's eyes, she began to understand its appeal. "It's different," she admitted. "Not what I expected." John smiled. "That's the thing about life out here. It's simple, but it's honest. You get out what you put in." Haley nodded, her mind turning over his words. She had spent so much of her life chasing things that felt empty. Status, appearances, her mother's approval. But here, on this farm, everything felt tangible, real. The thought made her stomach twist. That evening, Haley sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the air cool and quiet. John joined her, a beer in hand. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. "You think you'll ever leave this place?" Haley asked after a while, her voice soft. John took a sip of his beer, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know. This farm's been in my family for generations. It's all I've ever known." Haley studied him. "But don't you ever wonder what else is out there? What life could be like somewhere else?" John turned to her, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Sometimes, but I think there's a lot to be said for knowing where you belong." Haley looked away, his words hitting closer to home than she wanted to admit. "I don't know where I belong," she said quietly. John was silent for a moment before saying, "Maybe you're still figuring it out. That's okay." Haley swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She didn't know why his words affected her so much, but they did. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes without needing words. For the first time, Haley felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The next morning, Haley woke up with a strange sense of purpose. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one she hadn't felt in a long time. For weeks, she had told herself that this was temporary, that she was just enduring until she could figure out a way to leave. But something had changed. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between fixing fences, planting crops, and late-night talks on the porch, she had stopped fighting this place so much. She wasn't ready to admit that she liked it here, but she also wasn't in a hurry to leave. After dressing in a pair of worn jeans and a flannel shirt, her old designer clothes were now shoved in the back of her suitcase, forgotten. Haley made her way downstairs. John was at the table, drinking his usual morning coffee. He glanced up when she entered, his expression mildly surprised. "You're up early," he said. Haley poured herself a cup of coffee before sitting across from him. "Yeah, well, figured I might as well be useful." John smirked. "That's so?" She rolled her eyes. "Don't make a big deal out of it." He chuckled, setting his cup down. "All right, if you're so eager to be useful, how do you feel about driving into town today?" Haley blinked. "Town?" John nodded. "We need some supplies. Feed, hardware, a few other things. I was gonna go, but since you're on this whole being useful kick, you could take my truck." Haley hesitated. She hadn't driven since she had arrived at the farm, and she definitely hadn't driven a beat-up old truck. "Your truck?" she asked skeptically. John grinned. "Unless you want to take the tractor." She narrowed her eyes. "Fine, but if your truck breaks down, I'm not pushing it." John tossed her the keys. "Deal." Driving into town was an experience in itself. The truck was old, its steering loose, and the radio only worked when she hit the dashboard a few times. The roads were empty, stretching out in long, winding paths that made her miss the chaos of city traffic, at least a little. When she finally reached town, she realized just how different it was from what she was used to. It wasn't a place with towering buildings or endless boutiques. Instead, there were small shops, a diner with a faded neon sign, and a hardware store that looked like it had been there for decades. She pulled into the feed store first, checking the list John had given her. Inside, the smell of hay and grain filled the air, and an older man behind the counter greeted her with a friendly smile. "You must be John's wife," he said. Haley stiffened. The man chuckled. "Relax, sweetheart." He called ahead, said you'd be picking up supplies today, right? Of course he had. Still, the word wife made her stomach twist. It was a reminder of how absurd this whole arrangement was. She forced a polite smile. "Yep, that's me." The man handed her an invoice. "Everything's out back. You need help loading." Haley glanced at the list. Bags of feed, a few boxes of supplies, things that probably weighed more than she did. She was about to say yes when she caught herself. John wouldn't have asked her to do this if he didn't think she could handle it. "I got it," she said, surprising herself. By the time she finished loading everything into the truck, her arms were sore, and she was covered in dust, but she had done it. But she had. On her own, She climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Back at the farm, John was waiting outside when she pulled up. He leaned against the porch railing, watching with amusement as she parked the truck a little too fast. Sending up a cloud of dust, she hopped out, tossing him the keys. Mission accomplished. John caught them easily. No breakdowns. Nope, but your radio is a piece of junk. He chuckled. You get everything. Haley gestured toward the back of the truck. See for yourself. John walked over. Inspecting the load, he nodded approvingly. Not bad, city girl. Haley wiped her hands on her jeans. Told you I could handle it. John smirked. Guess I underestimated you. Haley crossed her arms. That's the first smart thing you've said all day. John laughed, shaking his head. That evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky painted in warm hues of orange and pink, Haley felt a strange sense of peace. She had spent the day doing something productive, something that mattered, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was just existing. She felt like she belonged. John glanced at her, his beer bottle resting against his knee. So, how was your first solo trip? Haley smirked. Honestly, it wasn't terrible. John raised an eyebrow. High praise. She chuckled. Don't get used to it. He smiled, taking a sip of his beer. They sat in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Haley had always thought she wanted a life full of excitement, movement, luxury. But now, sitting on this porch, watching the sunset over the fields, she wasn't so sure anymore. She had fought this place so hard. But maybe, just maybe, it was starting to feel like home. Haley woke up to the soft glow of morning sunlight streaming through her window. The familiar sound of roosters crowing, and the distant hum of John's tractor had become part of her new normal. She stretched, her muscles still sore but stronger than they had been when she first arrived. Each day felt a little less foreign, a little less forced. Still, as much as she had settled into life on the farm, a nagging feeling lingered in the back of her mind. This wasn't supposed to be permanent. She pulled on a sweatshirt and jeans before heading downstairs, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. John was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a mug. Morning, he said, glancing over his shoulder. Morning, she replied, grabbing a cup of her own. They drank in comfortable silence, the kind that had grown between them over the weeks. It was strange how natural it felt now, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table, sharing a quiet moment before the day began. John broke the silence first. We've got some work to do on the east field today. The storm messed up the irrigation lines. Think you can handle it? Haley raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to fix irrigation lines. That feels like a pretty big leap. John smirked. You've been surprising me lately. Figured I'd give you a challenge. Haley rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips. Fine, but if I break something, it's on you. The east field stretched out before them, the rows of crops glistening with dew in the morning sun. John led the way to a section where the storm had caused a few of the lines to burst, water pooling around the damaged areas. He crouched down, inspecting the break. It's not too bad. We'll replace this section and patch up the rest. Haley knelt beside him, mimicking his movements. All right, what do I do? John handed her a length of new tubing. Cut this to match the damaged piece, then we'll use these connectors to secure it. She nodded, taking the tubing and a pair of cutters. It was tedious work, and her hands ached from gripping the tools, but she found herself oddly focused. They worked in sync, John explaining each step as they went. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Haley could feel the sweat trickling down her back. You're a quick learner, John said after a while. Haley glanced at him, surprised. You really didn't think I'd be able to do this, did you? John chuckled. Honestly, no, but you're proving me wrong. Haley smirked. Get used to it. They finished the repairs by early afternoon. Standing back to inspect their work, the water flowed smoothly through the new lines, and the field was back to its usual rhythm. Not bad, John said, wiping his hands on his jeans. Haley placed her hands on her hips, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. I think I'm getting the hang of this, John smiled. You might be. Back at the house, Haley sat on the porch with a cold drink in hand. Watching the sun dip lower in the sky, John joined her a few minutes later, settling into the chair beside hers. "You've changed, you know," he said after a while, his voice quiet. Haley glanced at him. "What do you mean? When you first got here, you were so angry. You hated everything about this place. But now," he trailed off, gesturing toward the fields, "you're part of it." Haley looked out over the land, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows across the crops. He wasn't wrong. She had changed. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe I'm just adapting because I have to." John tilted his head. "Or maybe you're realizing there's more to life than what you had before." Haley didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure how to. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Haley broke the quiet. "Do you ever think about leaving?" John glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, but this place, it's home. It's in my blood." Haley nodded slowly. She envied his certainty, his sense of belonging. She had spent so much of her life chasing things, her mother's approval, success, status, but none of it had ever felt like home. "You don't have to decide anything right now," John said gently. "Sometimes it's okay to just be." Haley swallowed hard, his words hitting her in a place she wasn't ready to confront. "I'll try," she said softly. John smiled, tipping his bottle toward her in a small gesture of camaraderie. Later that night, as Haley lay in bed, her mind wouldn't stop racing. She stared at the ceiling, the quiet of the farmhouse pressing in around her. What was she doing here? She had spent so much of her life resisting her mother's control, trying to carve out her own path, and yet, here she was, living a life her mother would have never imagined for her, but one she had been forced into nonetheless. Was this really her choice? Or was she just settling because she didn't know what else to do? She thought of John, of the way he looked at the farm with quiet pride, of the way he worked tirelessly to keep everything running. He wasn't just surviving, he was living. Haley wasn't sure if she could ever feel that kind of contentment. But maybe. She wanted to try. Haley woke the next morning with a heavy feeling she couldn't shake. The sun was bright. The farm was alive with the sounds of animals and rustling leaves. Yet something inside her felt off. Her mind replayed the conversation she'd had with John the night before, his words about belonging still lingering in her thoughts. Was she really starting to belong here, or was she just fooling herself? She pushed the thoughts aside as she dressed and headed downstairs. John was already in the kitchen, as usual, sipping his coffee and looking over a list he'd scribbled on a scrap of paper. "Morning," he said, glancing up briefly. "Morning," Haley replied, grabbing a mug of coffee and sitting across from him. He slid the list toward her. "I've got to head into town later to pick up some parts for the tractor. Think you can handle feeding the animals while I'm gone?" Haley raised an eyebrow. "You're trusting me with your precious farm animals." John smirked. "Don't make me regret it." She rolled her eyes but took the list. "Fine, but if one of your cows decides to run off, that's on you," he chuckled, standing and grabbing his hat. "I think you'll manage." After John left, Haley stood on the porch, staring out at the fields. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over the land. The beauty of it was undeniable, but Haley couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She grabbed a bucket of feed and headed toward the chicken coop. First, the chickens clucked and pecked at the ground as she scattered the feed, their movements oddly soothing. She had never thought much about animals before, other than the occasional designer dog her friends paraded around, but there was something grounding about their simple needs. "One task down," she muttered to herself as she wiped her hands on her jeans. Next, she made her way to the barn to check on the cows. As she walked, the rhythmic sound of their lowing filled the air, mingling with the faint rustle of the breeze. The barn smelled of hay and earth, the sunlight streaming through the slats in golden beams. Haley set down the bucket and began pouring feed into the troughs, glancing occasionally at the cows as they approached. "All right, you guys," she said, her voice soft. "Eat up." One of the cows nudged her arm with its nose, startling her. She let out a small laugh, reaching out tentatively to pat its head. "You're not so bad," she admitted. The barn door creaked open, and Haley turned, expecting to see John. Instead, a tall woman stepped inside. She was dressed in clean, tailored clothes that stood out starkly against the rustic backdrop of the barn. Her sharp features and perfectly coiffed hair were unmistakable. "Eleanor?" Haley said, her voice icy. Eleanor Harrington surveyed the barn with a look of disdain, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." Haley crossed her arms. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor stepped closer, her heels clicking against the barn floor. "I wanted to see for myself how you were doing." "It seems you've settled into this little punishment." "It's not a punishment," Haley shot back. "It's my life now." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Is it? Living on a farm, feeding animals, doing manual labor? That's not the Haley I raised." "Maybe that's the point," Haley said, her voice trembling slightly. Eleanor's expression softened just enough to reveal a flicker of vulnerability. "Haley, I only wanted what was best for you. What was best for me," Haley snapped. "You wanted to control me, to make me into some perfect version of you. Well, guess what? I'm not you." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And yet here you are, living on a farm with a man you didn't choose, doing things you were never meant to do. Is this really what you want?" Haley opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. Was this what she wanted? She had spent weeks convincing herself that this was temporary, that she was only here because she had no choice. But now, she wasn't so sure. Eleanor took a step closer. "Come home, Haley. This doesn't have to be your life." Haley shook her head. "Home? You mean back to your world of expectations and suffocating rules? No thanks." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You're throwing away everything I worked so hard to give you, and maybe that's what I need," Haley said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy, the air between them charged with years of unspoken resentment. Finally, Eleanor sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "You're just like your father," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Always chasing something you can't even define." Haley's chest tightened. "Maybe I am, but at least I'm not afraid to try." Eleanor turned, her heels clicking sharply as she walked toward the door. "Don't say I didn't warn you, Haley," she said over her shoulder. Haley watched her leave, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. By the time John returned, the sun was low in the sky. Casting long shadows across the farm, Haley was sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Everything all right?" John asked as he climbed the steps, setting a bag of supplies down by the door. Haley hesitated before answering. "My mother was here." John frowned. "What did she want?" "To remind me that this isn't my life," Haley said bitterly. John sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "And what do you think?" Haley sighed, resting her elbows on her knees. "I don't know. She's not wrong. I never pictured myself here, but, John prompted. Haley looked out at the fields, the soft glow of twilight washing over them. "I think I'm starting to like it here. And that scares me." John was quiet for a moment before saying, "It's okay to be scared, Haley. Change is scary, but it's also how we grow." Haley turned to him, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I don't think I'm ready to face her yet." John nodded. "You don't have to. You just have to figure out what you want. For you, not for her." Haley swallowed hard, his words sinking in. "I'll try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John smiled. "That's all you can do." As the stars began to appear overhead, Haley felt a strange sense of calm. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she was okay with that. The morning after Eleanor's unexpected visit, Haley couldn't shake the feeling of unease lingering in her chest. The words her mother had spoken echoed in her mind. "Is this really what you want?" She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she wasn't sure she wanted to face the one forming inside her. For weeks, she had told herself she was surviving, adjusting out of necessity. But now, after everything, the work, the quiet evenings, the unexpected satisfaction of being part of something real, she had to admit to herself that she had stopped merely surviving. She was living, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. She stepped outside onto the porch, where John was already loading tools into the back of his truck. The early morning air was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold. "You good?" John asked, glancing up at her. Haley hesitated before answering. "I don't know." John leaned against the truck, wiping his hands on a rag. "Still thinking about your mom?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah, she got into my head, Made me question everything. John studied her for a moment. What do you want me to say? Haley met his gaze, frustration flickering in her chest. I don't know. Maybe tell me what to do. John smirked. That's not how this works, city girl. No one can make this decision for you. She sighed, knowing he was right, but wishing it were easier. You want to take a drive? John asked after a beat. Haley frowned. Where? John shrugged. Just drive. Clear your head. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, dust kicking up in the rearview mirror. Haley gripped the steering wheel, staring ahead as the farmland stretched endlessly on both sides. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove. Her mind raced. She thought about the life she had before. Glamorous parties, expensive clothes, a future meticulously planned by her mother. It had been comfortable, predictable, easy. But had she ever really been happy? Then she thought about the past few weeks, about waking up early, feeling the ache in her muscles after a hard day's work, the quiet satisfaction of seeing something she had helped build. She thought about John, about the way he listened, about the way he never tried to control her, but somehow still made her feel grounded. A crossroads was forming before her. The city, or the farm, the life she had known, or the one she was just beginning to understand. She pulled off the road, parking near an open field, climbing out of the truck. She stepped into the tall grass, the wind brushing against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the horizon. She had always been told who she was supposed to be, but for the first time, she was asking herself who she wanted to be, and she wasn't sure of the answer. By the time she got back to the farm, the sun was beginning to set. She found John in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. He looked up when she walked in. Feel better? He asked. Haley sighed, leaning against the wooden beam. Not really, but I think I needed that. John nodded, not pressing her for more. That was what she liked about him. He never pushed her beyond what she was ready to say. She hesitated before speaking again. What if I don't know where I belong? John set down the brush and turned to face her fully. Then you figure it out, and that takes time. She swallowed hard. But what if I make the wrong choice? John gave her a small smile. Then you pick yourself up and try again. Haley looked down, her heart pounding. I've never done that before. My whole life was planned for me. I never had to make a real decision. John took a step closer, his voice softer. Maybe it's time you start. She looked up at him then, really looked at him. The warmth in his eyes, the quiet strength he carried. It steadied her in a way nothing else ever had. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. I don't want to go back to that life. John's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something like understanding, maybe even hope. Then don't, he said simply. Haley's breath caught. It sounded so easy when he said it, but she knew it wasn't. Leaving her old life behind meant more than just staying on the farm. It meant facing Eleanor, cutting ties with the world she had known, and embracing something uncertain. But wasn't that what she had wanted all along? She took a slow breath. I need to be sure. John nodded. Take your time. Haley hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, her fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but the way John's breath hitched told her he had noticed. She wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but maybe, just maybe, she was getting closer. Haley woke up the next morning with a knot in her stomach. She had barely slept, her mind a battlefield of questions she couldn't silence. John's words from the night before echoed in her head. Then don't. Could it really be that simple? She pulled on a flannel shirt and jeans, tying her hair back in a loose ponytail. Her movements were mechanical, her thoughts elsewhere. As she stepped out onto the porch, the crisp morning air did little to calm the unease growing inside her. John was already outside, repairing the hinges on the barn door. He glanced up when he saw her, his expression unreadable. Morning, he said. Morning, she replied, shoving her hands into her pockets. The silence stretched between them, heavier than usual. Haley wasn't sure what to say, and John, true to form, wasn't the type to push. Finally, she took a deep breath. I need to go back. John's hand stilled on the hinge, but he didn't look surprised. Back to the city. She nodded. Just for a few days. I need to talk to my mother, sort things out. I need to know. She hesitated, swallowing hard. I need to know if I can really leave that life behind. John studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. I get it, Haley exhaled, relieved but also disappointed. She had half expected him to try to convince her to stay. But John wasn't like that. He had never tried to control her, never told her what to do, and maybe that was why she trusted him. I'll take you into town, he said simply. She met his gaze. Thank you. The drive to town was quiet. Haley stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. It was strange how familiar everything had become. The winding dirt roads, the golden fields stretching toward the horizon. A month ago, she had resented every second here. Now, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. They pulled up outside the bus station, a small, nondescript building with a faded sign. John put the truck in park but didn't shut off the engine. Haley turned to him. I don't know how long I'll be gone. John nodded, gripping the steering wheel. I know. She hesitated. But I will come back. His jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes were steady. I'll hold you to that. She forced a smile. You better. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, things neither was ready to say. Then, before she could overthink it, she leaned over and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. John stilled, his eyes widening slightly as she pulled back. Just in case I get lost out there, she said softly. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. You won't. Haley swallowed hard, nodded once, then grabbed her bag and stepped out of the truck. She didn't look back as she walked into the station. She was afraid if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. The city felt different, or maybe she was the one who had changed. Haley stepped out of the cab, staring up at the towering building she had once called home. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Pristine, polished, perfect, and yet she felt out of place. As she walked through the grand entrance, the familiar scent of expensive perfume and fresh-cut flowers filled the air. The receptionist, a woman who had worked for her family for years, barely blinked at her arrival. Miss Harrington, she greeted with a polite nod. Your mother is expecting you. Of course. She was. Eleanor was always 5 steps ahead. Haley's footsteps echoed against the marble floors as she made her way upstairs. When she reached her mother's office, she didn't bother knocking. Eleanor looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. So, you came back? Haley crossed her arms. I needed to talk to you. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying her daughter. I see. And what have you decided? Haley hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had spent her entire life being controlled by this woman, told what to do, how to act, who to be, not anymore. I'm not staying, she said, her voice steady. I wanted to see if I still belonged here, but I don't. My life isn't here anymore. Eleanor's lips pursed slightly. And where exactly is your life, Haley? On some farm, playing house with a man you barely know. Haley's jaw tightened. It's my choice. Eleanor sighed, standing from her desk. She walked around it slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. I suppose I should be proud. You've finally found your independence. Haley narrowed her eyes. Somehow, that doesn't sound like a compliment. Eleanor smirked faintly. Because it isn't, but it is the truth. Haley lifted her chin. Then I guess that's all there is to say. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, but don't expect me to come running when this experiment of yours fails. Haley smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I won't. Without another word, she turned and walked out. This time, she didn't feel like she was running away. She felt like she was finally running toward something. The bus ride back was long, but Haley didn't mind. Every mile that passed, every stretch of road that pulled her further from the city, felt like confirmation. By the time she stepped off the bus in town, her heart was racing. She wasn't sure what she expected when John pulled up in his truck. But when she saw him leaning against the hood, arms crossed, waiting for her, something inside her settled. You're back, he said. Haley smiled. Told you I would be. John smirked. How was the city? Haley shrugged. Not home. His expression softened, and for the first time, she felt completely certain. She wasn't just staying because she had to. She was staying because she wanted to. The drive back to the farm was different this time. Haley wasn't watching the roads with a sense of detachment, thinking of them as a temporary detour in her life. No, this time, every turn felt familiar. Every stretch of land felt like something she was returning to, rather than running from. She wasn't lost anymore. John hadn't said much since picking her up from the bus station, but she could feel his glances, the quiet way he was trying to gauge her mood. He had always been like that, observant, steady, never pushing her for answers she wasn't ready to give. Finally, as they turned down the long dirt road leading to the farmhouse, he spoke. "You sure about this?" Haley turned to him, meeting his gaze. "Yeah," she said simply. "I am." A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Relief, maybe, or something deeper. But as always, John just nodded. Accepting her answer without hesitation, he trusted her to know her own mind. She wasn't sure anyone had ever done that before. The first thing Haley did when she got back to the farmhouse was kick off her city shoes. She had worn them out of habit, but as soon as her feet hit the wooden floor, she realized how wrong they felt. She was used to boots now, to dirt roads and fields that stretched for miles. John leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "So, what now?" Haley exhaled, glancing around the house. Everything was just as she had left it. Simple, warm, real. She turned back to him. "Now, I figure out how to make this my home." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Sounds like a plan." The next few days passed in a blur. Haley didn't waste time easing back into things. She dove in head first. She helped John repair fences, feed the animals, even took over some of the bookkeeping that had started to pile up while she was gone. She expected it to feel like work. Instead, it felt like living. One afternoon, as she was stacking hay bales in the barn, John walked in, arms crossed. "You know, you don't have to prove anything," he said. Haley wiped sweat from her forehead. "Who says I'm proving anything?" John smirked. "You're working harder than I am." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Maybe a small part of her was trying to prove something. Not to him, but to herself. That this wasn't just some impulsive decision. That she could do this. That she wanted to. One evening, they sat on the porch, as they often did. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, the air cool and still. Haley took a sip of her drink, then glanced at John. "You never asked me why I came back." John rested his elbows on his knees, watching the horizon. "Didn't need to." Haley raised an eyebrow. "You weren't curious." John turned to her, his blue eyes steady. "I figured when you were ready to tell me." "You would." Haley exhaled slowly, setting her glass down. "My mother offered me everything. She said I could go back, pretend none of this ever happened, that I could have my old life back." John nodded but said nothing. Haley looked out at the fields, at the land she had once resented, and now couldn't imagine leaving. "I realized I didn't want it. The clothes, the parties, the expectations, it all felt so hollow. And this place," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "this place feels real." John was quiet for a moment, then said, "So you're staying?" Haley turned to him, her chest tightening. "I'm staying." She saw the relief in his eyes before he looked away. Nodding. "Good," he said simply. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Good." The next morning, Haley woke up with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. As she stepped outside, the golden light of dawn bathed the fields in a warm glow. She inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of earth, of morning air, of something that felt undeniably hers. John was already out in the pasture, checking on the livestock. She walked toward him, feeling, knowing, that this was where she belonged. "Where do you need me today?" she asked as she reached him. John turned to her, a small smile playing at his lips. "Wherever you want to be, city girl." Haley grinned. "Guess I'm not a city girl anymore." John chuckled. "Guess not." And as they stood there, side by side, with the sun rising over the land, Haley knew she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not just a place, not just a home, but a life that was truly hers,